Hey, let's start the show for Thursday, June 4th, 2020. Welcome to This Is Only a Test, the official podcast of tested.com. I'm Norm, and joining me for a different kind of episode today, well, you know them, it's Jeremy Williams
Hello, fellas.
and Kishore Hari.
Hello.
We thought music wouldn't necessarily be super appropriate this week because we're going to have a little bit of a different episode this week. Full transparency. We're not going to talk about the usual topics that you might tune in to listen to us talk about every week. But we will, obviously come back to a normal episode of This Is Only a Test. Talk about technology, pop culture, VR, science, of course. But it's kind of it's, as you may have heard on Still Untitled, and if you've been following the news, obviously, it's been quite a week, and we thought it might make sense for us at least to use this as an opportunity to talk amongst each other, to talk to each other about it, and so hope you'll join us for that conversation. So we're recording this on the evening of Wednesday, June the 3rd, and already since in the past 24 hours, a lot has happened. But first and foremost, both of you guys went out and did some participation. Let's talk about that.
I wouldn't have been there had Kishore not tweeted it. 2-3 days ago? A student-led solidarity march in San Francisco from Mission High School to the Mission Police Department. Wow.
It ended up going a lot of different directions. The student-led protest was in solidarity with all the marches around the country and now the world. But it was really based on the idea of justice for George Floyd. And we should admit, first of all, that we actually tried to record something this morning, and it was kind of a mess. Like, we were kind of garbled all over the place. So we're doing a take two, and I feel really differently now than I did this morning, partially because of the news of the day. 3 other officers were charged in the murder of George Floyd, but also the being out there with all of those people. There's probably like 15,000 people I saw reports of in this protest. But it wasn't just that. I've been to a lot of protests in my life. I've organized a lot of protests in my life. There was kind of a generosity to this one that was so incredibly beautiful. I'm used to like being on marches and people being like, water, $1. Here, everyone was handing you everything you needed. And as one person put it, the revolution will be fed. There were so many people like taking care of other people so that they could express their anger, their frustration, their sadness, all of that spectrum of emotion that so many people are feeling.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people. I mean, I don't know how many you expected, but I didn't expect there to be that many people there. And that I found that just the sheer number of people to speak volumes. And I am not as experienced as you are with demonstrations, and I realized just how important the signs are. And I brought my kids, and that's probably the main reason why we went, because I wanted this to be real for them. And I knew that taking them to see people demonstrating would start to crystallize what's going on. Because it's really hard to talk to them about what's going on because they don't have the historical context.
Well, that's something I'd love to talk about on this podcast, because it's not something that we had a chance to talk about on Still Untitled. And it's something we brought up, but it's something that I think a lot of listeners are also grappling with, is one, how to have open conversations and introspection for yourself, which is something I think we're all trying to do, and which is why at this point, this being, having talked about it on Still Entitled and having talked to you guys this morning about it, and then talking about it now, you know what? It's helpful. It's helpful to get it out there, and but also how to talk to your kids as well, because while protests are things that, like you said, Kishore, you've taken part of and you've organized, the circumstances here do feel different, right? Not that there's any normal about any of this, but with the we're still in the middle of a pandemic, and that I'm sure weighs heavily on everyone's mind as well. Being out there and those two things coming together, which are 100% interconnected, right?
I actually want to tell you something. We actually went to Dolores Park yesterday at the same time, and I'm not going to say it was because we thought the demonstration was yesterday, but I'm not saying that. And there was nobody wearing a mask in Dolores Park, right? And I guess they had the space to maybe operate that way, but at the same time, it just felt a little cavalier. Today, I don't remember seeing one person not wearing a mask.
I think I counted 4, and one of those people was on a horse. And
That's
like
right.
the amount of attention in going to the protests this week to the COVID public health guidelines has been significant. Now, social distancing when you have 15,000 people marching down a street is impossible. Like it's impossible. Period. So there is risk there. But I want to be like super clear. Like every place I've gone to that's been associated to these protests, like the first thing I hear from organizers, from people on the street is like, do you need a mask? So I think there's some acknowledgement that these two public health crises, the crisis of COVID and what I think is a public health crisis, what a lot of public health experts think is a public health crisis, this violence against the Black community from the police, they're intertwined, and we can't necessarily separate them. But by like dealing with them together, maybe there's a way that we can actually make progress against both. I actually I organized a bunch of scientists to come with me today, which is, not new ground for me, but I ended up spending a lot of time talking to a lot of UCSF doctors and nurses and students. They're all out there. And it reminded me of like 6 years ago when I was working at UCSF. The students led a walkout of the university in the aftermath of the Ferguson protest. And I remember we took over Parnassus Avenue and like we all kind of laid down in the way that Mike Brown did. And talking to them, they're like, this isn't the first time we've shown up for this. Like people are making that like a remarkable thing to see doctors in this public health crisis show up on this one. And they were like, no, this is an issue we've known about for a long time. We're continuing to show up around it. And when you think about it that way, it changes like the perspective of like the risk of the pandemic. But I do want to end by saying like, President Obama, I think, said it best. Like what we're seeing right now, I've never seen in my lifetime. Like I think back to we've lived through Ferguson and the LA riots of the 90s. And I was too young to really understand what was going on in the aftermath of the Rodney King incident. But I was out in the streets after Ferguson. I understood what was happening. I've marched in a lot of Black Lives Matter protests over the years, but this is it's just different. And it's different because the people in the streets aren't just the Black community. There are so many people out there representative, a cross-sectional representation of everyone. Like I felt like I was with the people of the Mission District today, standing out there.
Well, let's be explicit about it, right? Because it's I don't think we've talked about it explicitly in this take of the podcast yet, of what it is that's going on that the protests are trying to change, and that's systemic racism in America and in the world, and especially in the policing systems. And I know everything that's said feels very loaded, and that's why it's something that, as a culture in America, it's not something that's been taken to heart or really processed, right? It's kind of been living underneath everything for the past 400 years or so. So let's explicitly talk about what it is in the systems and how, and how is, not authorities on this, and certainly not people that it affects, right? None of us are the Black people who are oppressed by this, like how we feel about it, and hopefully allow listeners out there to be introspective as well about it. So what happened to George Floyd in being murdered, is just the most visible example of late of a Black man being killed by the police, which is something that happens. And the injustice there, the explicit injustice, is that the police are there to, the relationship with the community, people, civilians, us, and the police isn't what it's supposed to be. And there is no, I understand that policing is not an easy job, right? Like I can't even fathom like how difficult parts of that job are. And all of us, I think we have friends who are police officers. But the way they do their jobs should be held to a higher standard, because the power they have is an awesome one. And it's the power to take our liberty away.
Right. Wait. I want to say, not to a higher standard, the same standard that we're held to. Like,
at the bare minimum. I mean, at the bare minimum.
At the bare minimum, right?
Like, but even more so, because they, like, what they have is the greatest privilege, right? Because they are supposed to be serving the community, right? And the fact that they can not only take your liberty, but your life, and then the systems in place that don't allow those actions to be held accountable, not through any like logical reason or not. Like if you hear about, how the systems, the police unions work to protect, the bad actors, that's the injustice. And that's the overt injustice. And the systemic injustice is that we live in a society where, as a culture, we have allowed that to happen.
Right. Yeah. There have been protests before. There's been outrage before. This is not the first incident of its kind, sadly. And this
is the 400th this year.
Nothing has changed. And you're right. And I feel like we've reached the breaking point, and there's been lots of discussion. Why is that? Because we're in the middle of coronavirus. There's lots of unhappiness and tension and unemployment already. Is because of the administration, which is just throwing, fuel on the fire and making it worse, is in calling National Guard and cops to create more animosity and more tension. And that all may be true, but the good news is that we like the animosity the rage hasn't stopped yet, and it doesn't show any signs of it. And I know that we live in San Francisco, and I feel like we're very fortunate to be here. It is not like what we saw today in Mission Dolores. It is not like that everywhere. I got home and it was like a complete opposite. I started watching Sean from Rec Room has been live streaming on Twitter from the Seattle streets, and it's not a happy place. They have the National Guard. They're lined up in formation. They're in riot gear. They have gas masks on, and like nobody is from what I can see is doing anything to provoke the police. And yet the police look so intimidating. And it's that
for
element.
The bulk of the protests that we were part of today, I saw 6 cops total, like across that day. There was more, stationed and kind of hidden away, but they specifically were invisible, in contrast to what you're saying in Seattle.
Right. Yeah. And it's, I don't, it's like, it's almost like that is part of the problem. Like that cops perceive their duty as, as holding the line and almost being in a combative, form, as versus a serving and protecting form where to be clear, like some of those heartwarming, reassuring images that I have seen recently are of police chiefs and police officers marching or kneeling with protesters. I think that they have discovered that works. And I hope that message spreads, because we need more of that solidarity from the police officers. And I'm glad you mentioned, Norton, that we have friends in the police force, because this protest is not about all police. It's about racism. And when racism gets into the police force, it does especially bad things.
So the thing that has always spoken to me as somebody that tries to look at things scientifically, or at least through a data lens, is like there was a paper out last year that analyzed like our best data, which is assembled by journalists through the Fatal Encounters database, of how likely, if you're a young Black man aged 20 to 34, how likely are you over your lifetime to die to police violence? And it's a 1 in 1,000. For a white person, it's 1 in 2,500. So you're 2.5 times more likely as a Black man to be killed by the police than if you are a white man. The only explanation for why there's that big a difference is the system. You don't explain that away by saying there are just some bad cops out there. That doesn't like carry water. It doesn't hold up to rigorous analysis. It is a system that somehow incentivizes, or at least creates the environment for Black people to be unfairly targeted and profiled by this system.
Mm-hmm.
And I fully believe that police officers are also, in a really different way, like abused by that system too. Like they're put in this environment where they can't succeed. I don't have answers why. Where it gets where it's been uncomfortable for me and harder for me this week is when you start to multiply out the effects of that. Like the fact that if I'm a young Black man, I'm just scared of the police, and I have no trust in this whole organization that's supposed to serve and protect me to actually look out for me, and how that's replicated in so many other industries, in science, in like when I go shopping, and like, you know, we can just go on and on and on through technology. Every industry that plays out, it plays out differently. And that's what's been really uncomfortable and like a difficult place, is for when I was talking to my son about all of this week, it was easier to actually talk about the police stuff because there's visible, tangible evidence of that. It's much harder to talk about the invisible stuff that isn't on tape, but that is an absolute result of that same set of systems that is causing this.
I wanted to point out another thing that Obama said today, which in a sense kind of corrected me from our first take of this podcast, where I said I wanted to see someone at the top send a message down through the country's police force that there must be change. Obama said very clearly this change will happen with local elections. That most of the people who are responsible for appointing sheriffs are elected officials, and that's what people have to show up for. This movement has to continue to the voting booth.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the movement itself. Like the thing also that I'm sure a lot of people feel uncomfortable about is the disruption the movement has and protests have in, you know, this already disrupted time, right? And that's, I think, the kind of the point of the protests, right? Like peaceful assembly, like we want the protests to get in our faces about this because we have not been confronted with it, and it is a confrontation. Like we should be confronting our own selves with, you know, what has been going on, and there's no excuse to be complacent about it.
I fully admit I have never had a Black Lives Matter poster in my window, given all of the atrocities that have happened in the past. Now I do, and I hope that is a sign of change in myself, maybe my family, and I don't know to what extent it'll change my relationship with the Black people in my life, but I think part of moving forward is is an acknowledgement that there is an unfairness to the game that people are playing in just existing. And
that's yeah, it's the first step, right? And it's even though it's as as simple as saying it, right? Saying the words Black Lives Matter or writing it out or showing up, it is a big step. And it's a step that so many people resist. And it's something I tried to talk about and understand, and Still Untitled. Why is there resistance to this idea?
Well, it's easy to have that knee-jerk all lives matter reaction to it. I mean, I have sympathy for that because I think that's where I was not recently, but I do feel like when I first heard Black Lives Matter, I felt that. And as Adam eloquently put it on Still Untitled, Black Lives Matter, the very essence of that movement is all lives matter.
Your house isn't burning.
Right.
Their houses are burning.
Exactly.
And I think there's because of the way the information's been spread, like we have to point to what's different about 2020, 2019, from Ferguson, those years ago, 5 years ago. There's more, people are filming more, it's being spread more, and the very avenues that allow the information to be spread and allow movements like this to have life are also in many ways the reasons that people don't agree with it or don't see it that way, because those very systems of social media, of cable news also keep people isolated and seeing only what the people they follow see. And again, it goes back to why I think it's important. Like what I was surprised by these past couple of days is even, Tuesday was a day where people didn't stop promoting their own work, like stop publishing.
Blackout Tuesday.
Exactly. And it wasn't about, tiling your Instagram walls with black boxes. That was the wrong way to do it. And everyone understood that. It was about amplifying the voices, but also trying to, as a society, come together with a voice to acknowledge, right, that Black lives do matter. And even the act of saying it, I think I was surprised at how many people who follow, Tested and follow us may not agree completely. I'm not going to say that, of course, it's a wide spectrum, right? There are people who are trolls.
That would be boring if everyone agreed to us.
Right. But and there's a whole range of like people who agree to different lengths of it. And it's been really interesting to read the comments. And yes, we're reading the comments for that episode and trying to understand. People have reached out directly. Many people, I think, in your shoes, Jeremy, and like talking about and trying to come forward and trying to have this conversation of like how they've been changing the way they think from when they grew up, to people who still, maybe the reason that they don't agree with it is because of the way the message is being delivered, or because of their disbelief in, in one part of it. And that's the part that I'm trying to reconcile. Like, how can you, when you see this, when you see like clear video evidence and visual evidence of the racism, like that's clear injustice. You can't deny that that's happening.
You can deny it. Like people are denying it. And like, that's part of this. I'm going to sound like I did at the end of January or sometime in early February. Like it feels different right now, but I actually don't know if anything's going to change at all. The evidence tells us, like looking back at history, that nothing will change from this moment, that we really won't see reform. But it's up to us now to decide the fate. It is our actions, not the Black community's actions. It's us, like people like us that have inherited a level of ability to drive change in this society, that are the majority of people in this society that can make and drive change. So
I do think it's different, though. I do think that
it feels different.
It does, right? Like, I think, as empathetic as we are as people, this past week has been really like, it's caused more introspection in the people I know, in my family, in my friend circle, than I think the past instances in the past protests have. And I think that means something. I think that's not a singular thing.
Yeah, but introspection doesn't equate to policy change. Like the work is ahead of us.
Yes.
Now,
Well,
for all those people that did the introspection, that is awesome. And like myself included, it is a massive thing. But if you are really desirous of change, like there's work ahead, like what does it look like in September for us to still be saying Black Lives Matter in our actions? What does it look like November 3rd when we hit a first election to start thinking about the local election, as Jeremy said, through the lens of like, what does the Black community, especially around policing, what reforms do they want, and how am I going to represent that in my vote? Like those are things. Like our memory is fickle about these events. So like the hard work is still absolutely ahead, and it's when you pair those things that things change. I mean, that's what President Obama was saying today. It's like the protest in a way is the easy part. The hard part comes next.
Well, and they're both necessary.
Yeah. And one going back to what both of you have said, and referring to President Obama's speech earlier today, is that it's about participation in democracy. It's about being involved and being aware of not just every 4 years the big national elections, but also the statewide elections and the local elections and things that can, hopefully in most cases, actually affect like who gets to run the police departments and the policies that happen on a very local level. And that's, what the awesome part of that is? That's nonpartisan, right? Like it doesn't even matter if you out there completely agree with us on, on the protest or on all everything we're talking about. We still want America as a whole to be, one, more informed, and two, to participate more in the civic process and in democracy. And I think as a society, we would benefit from that.
Do you feel like anybody who responded in the comments disagrees with that?
No, but I don't think anyone feels strongly about it. And again, acknowledgement isn't change, right? All this introspection, like you said, Kishore, it's hopefully it is enacting the way enacting new conversations that you guys have with your kids, and that is something that going forward will hope over time maybe change the way we think. But in the near term, I do hope that, and I do think that participation in local elections and just voting, that is something that even if people believe it, I don't think they believe it, shall actually take action to it.
The introspection is important for me too. Like for the first time in a really long time, like I grew up in a household that I would call like casually racist. Like I was taught to be scared of Black people. We oftentimes grew up in like white kind of like semi-rural or at least suburban areas, and like we talked about that as a family. So freaking uncomfortable to talk about that as a family.
You know what? That's well acknowledged too, right? Like I think comedians have had that as a regular bit in their, growing up, the racist mom advice, right? Don't go into those neighborhoods because they'll take your cell phones, right? Like that's.
I grew up with just my mom, pretty much. It was just me and her, and we moved around a lot, so I never really had a consistency at school. So I was never really part of any kind of group. So I grew up like almost the opposite, like completely naive about almost like the existence of that kind of like racism and hatred. Although I kind of knew abstractly that it existed, and so coming to terms with the reality of it is heartbreaking and really difficult to go deep. And to feel what needs to be felt after so long of existing, of living my own life.
And I think it's hard to confront with that because that word racism and that word racist, it's such a powerful word, and it's an appropriate word because the magnitude to which this is happening is commensurate with all the connotations of that word. And that's what's we have to reconcile with, right? Like complacency and benefiting passively in a system that is racist is still racism, even if it's not the same as, overt racism. That's what I think so many people are resistant to, people who may not agree with Black Lives Matter as a movement, because it's being called out for something that you never knew that you were doing, consciously, and it's disrupting your life in, and the way that, your worldview, when you never feel like you have an overt privilege or benefit to it, right? It's a passive privilege. Kishore, I grew up in the very same family as you, right? Where, I think like that kind of passive racism was definitely present, but it wasn't even just like othering, minorities, other minorities. There's a feeling that even as, immigrant family, you're competing against that, the other minorities, right? Like, I think
the
there's
model
a lot,
minority piece.
yeah,
like
and there's
you have to be excellent,
and that I know that, in the Asian community, there's a resistance to support for Black Lives Matter, especially in the immigrant generation, because they definitely don't feel that same privilege, that's spoken of, right? But the three of us are way closer on the side of white privilege than we are on the side of the life that a Black person would have to go through in America.
White privilege almost has nothing to do with being white. Like is like where I've like landed. It is like that ability, as I think, was it Adam that put it, like you're just starting the game on normal, on easy mode compared to hard mode. Like,
and people don't feel that it's easy, right? Like there are plenty
it's
of
not. It's still
white
a hard
Americans.
game.
Exactly.
Yeah, everyone suffers. It's like from the moment that a baby sees their parent leave the room, doesn't have object permanence, and bursts into tears, like that is the worst thing in the world that's ever possibly going to ever happen to me. People have their own experiences and think that that's the end of the line, and they just haven't gone further.
But this isn't a competition to see who's suffered more. This is like,
no.
Well, that equality is not zero sum, right? To be not racist, or to support and to call out injustice, and to, bear witness to that and be supportive at the very least, right? Does not affect your ability to fight for, the livelihood of your family.
Yeah. To put a point on it in terms of this show, we cover some of the most racist industries that exist. When you think about pop culture and entertainment and technology and science, those have incredible racist legacies. Like, we are talking about, just like in most cases, just some bare minimum of representation. Like, can these people get a job or an interview, for goodness sakes? We're talking on such like a base level that we haven't even addressed the real kind of like racist components of those places. And if I have a wish, like a growth, an uncomfortable place for me to go from this, is that, particularly on this show, is like we're willing to talk about that more, because it's true. And as progressive as some of those areas get known for, it's just not borne out in the experience that we see of people.
Yeah, we have never had an African American on this very podcast. Something that, regrettably, that we had to admit to ourselves when we were discussing, whether or not to do this show. I don't think that means that we find one and we get somebody on the show immediately. But
Why do you think that is? That we haven't?
We haven't.
No.
Well, I imagine that it's probably comes down to our network, our personal networks of makers and the people we've come in contact with.
I think there's a comfort level that we have in the existing people that we know, and it's more representative of who we know and who we have not met yet.
On some level, I'd even admit that I'm scared of, like, I was a little nervous about changing the order of the show the other week because of how, like, the audience reacts, and like worried about how the audience reacts dictating what we care about in the show. um and realizing how that probably has been a component to this. That sucks. And it's really sad that I've been part of that.
I want to talk about what participation looks like in its many forms, because you guys went to attend protests. You obviously, people can donate, and you can educate yourself. But what are the different ways that you guys have thought about and you guys have heard being offered up as opportunities to participate, not just this week but going forward?
I mean, for me, it's one day at a time, and it's keeping my kids aware of it, because I don't want them to think, oh, that was what happened on Wednesday. This is another day. So for me, it's very, very much just about my own little existence here and with my family. But as we talked about, certainly voting going forward is going to be a major priority.
To me, it's educate, inform, and activate. So educate really about myself and my son and my family, about places I can learn. And I've been listening to different stuff this week. And it shouldn't just be this week that I'm listening to that different stuff. Um, Inform is like, I feel like a willingness to have those difficult, uncomfortable conversations in the places that I occupy. That means
Yeah.
like where I work, where I live, with my friends, with all of you, and be willing to share what I've learned, but also listen to other people's experiences and what they know. Uh, and then activate is to do something about it. And I think voting is definitely one. I want to see some policy changes come into play, but also just like organizing and giving like more momentum and voice to activities that are already happening. There has been a long tradition of advocacy in these communities that are most affected by what we're talking about, and it's in some ways just a matter of inertia and momentum. And so activate to me is, what can I do to advocate for them, with them, and for more quicker.
Yeah.
Well,
And so
you certainly provided the momentum that got my family out there, and I want to thank you for that. Because had you not tweeted, "Let's gather, let's get out, let's show up at this time on this day," then I wouldn't have been there. So I appreciate that.
it's a start, right?
Yeah.
It's a start for all of us.
There's some resources. We're going to include them in the description in the YouTube video, in the show notes. But I think there's a great document called June Justice that's, it's almost a curriculum. And it's, if that's the easier way for you to process and to spend some time each day to educate yourself, there's links to, articles, books and videos, even things that you'd be watching normally, like TED Talks about, and all of that, I think, in culmination helps you be a better communicator with your own self and then also with your friends and family. It's a strange time because we have been in lockdown for 3 months and we've only had our close family to talk to, really, and in many ways we've been like more isolated in our own communities than ever. And yet this is a time that's forcing us to have those conversations in those circles, and then also remotely, like we're doing right now. And hopefully people listening to the podcast, like this is like this awkward and this uncomfortable conversation is us figuring it out and talking to each other about it. And I know many people listen to the podcast and listen like, like they know us, or listen like, and look to us as friends that on the internet, and we want to engage with you as well. And even if you don't completely agree, right, like this is a chance to open a dialogue, and I will be reading the comments, and we'll be reading the comments, and I want to know how your conversations are going with your own family and your friends and yourself, right?
Yeah. I will say, like, we can't ignore this is all happening during a global pandemic. We crossed 105,000 American deaths. That is a number that I still have not grappled with, like what that emotional toll is. Like, I had a family member pass away from COVID not too long ago, and like watching a memorial on Zoom, and I have not come to terms with that yet. So there's risks with all of this. Like, I took a risk today. Jeremy and I both took a risk today. That is not a risk that's appropriate for everyone. So whatever is within a level of safety that you're comfortable with. There's no such thing as zero risk in this time. There's no such thing as zero risk while being Black in America. There is a risk that you have to be comfortable with in engaging with this stuff if you really want to see some change, whether it's in yourself or in your community around you.
Our lives are already disrupted, right? Like this extra, like,
I don't know. I don't know if we would see the amount of protests that we've seen if lives weren't as disrupted as they are. I mean, I don't mean to say silver lining, but I mean, we are in a really hard time right now.
Probably not, because there are certain distractions of like the normal world that weren't there. Like, we didn't have sports or music concerts or these events or restaurants to go to that wouldn't have all shut down because of this. But what happened was spectacularly brutal. Spectacularly brutal.
Yeah.
And so
I mean, there's 100% no denying that. Like, even if you're of the mindset that is an isolated incident, which I disagree with, or there's no denying, if you've seen the video, that what happened was callous and brutal and an injustice, and those officers who have now been charged, all four of them, should be held accountable. And if they're not, and if the system allows for that not to happen, right, for them to be reinstated, like, there's no more obvious sign of
then there's going to be a new system
of the injustice, right?
I learned something this afternoon, actually. There was a study done between 2005 and 2017, 12 years. There were 80 police officers who were arrested because of a fatal shooting. 35% of them got sentenced. Only 35%. And I think, like, the part of the problem, yes, obviously, is that officers aren't even being held accountable and arrested to begin with, who commit these atrocities. But once they go to trial, they are so often let go by the jury, who trusts police officers. And I think I'd like to believe that this point in time is going to lead to more objectivity when it comes to being in the jury box on a police trial.
And in many times that's not even made transparent to, quote unquote, civilians, because the standards that police have, there are regulations that they've built into, the system with their unions and with, their own internal affairs, that it's definitely a different standard, because it's a hard job, right? Fully acknowledge that policing is a hard job. But also, like, so much of the examples we're seeing right now are happening in, like, these big cities, and obviously NYPD, LAPD are these big, like, in many cases, like, multi-billion-dollar organizations in which the structural change isn't going to happen overnight, and it's a very, very different type of change that we're hoping for in the small town and most of America, police stations and communities, where what we were hoped for is that the relationship between the police and the community is improved from different types of recruitment, from different types of training, from the systems being run differently.
I remember growing up and knowing my police officer's name, and having a world of confidence when he came to our classroom, a couple times a year, that the police were there to protect me if something happened. I want to get to that place again.
That's one of the hardest parts about talking to your kids about this, because they're so afraid of the world already. You want them to believe that police are there for them, just like you want them to, if they're lost at a mall, find a mommy or a police officer, and so like that is a tricky balance, but it's something that I have the luxury of choosing whether or not to balance, and people with dark skin don't have that luxury with their kids.
Yeah, it's not enough to try to tell your kids that to just be good and be kind and be moral and treat everyone the same, that golden rule. It's because they're not going to grow up in a vacuum where they're going to start off everyone's going to start off at an even playing field. And I think a lot of what we're hoping, the talks that are happening with families right now, is helping kids understand that it's not a level playing field.
Right.
Yeah.
Whew. It's emotionally draining talking about this. I just want to acknowledge that too.
It's emotionally draining for a lot of people. I like a lot of people that have been working on this issue for a long time have just been using the common phrase of "I'm exhausted." I was exhausted with the pandemic to begin with, like a level of exhaustion that I wasn't ready for.
Yeah. Imagine having an earthquake under your feet this afternoon.
What? Oh, is that what happened in LA?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
So I just wanted to share something else that I thought about recently, which is about looting, which I kind of started out just being really, really frustrated with it, because it seemed like it just detracts from the moral high ground that this movement needs to retain. And I saw images of a dude walking out of a store with a surfboard. A couple ladies just giggling coming out of Victoria's Secret, arms full of new undergarments, and nobody seemed to have any. No. This was not with purpose. This was just stealing. This was just looting, and I was feeling very angry about that this was happening, because I didn't want the media paying any attention to it. And then I kind of just realized that you can't have one without the other, and it's almost like looting they're the barnacles that grow on these types of this kind of atrocity, this kind of riot. When you have protests that are passionate enough, you eventually do also have riots, and you also have looting. Like they just come together when you have this much passion behind something.
Yeah, I mean, I think I know what you're saying. Like, we're not advocating, obviously, like the burning down of buildings and right, looting. Like these are like lawful and peaceful assembly.
Yes.
is what we're advocating. But the reality is, like, the fear that people have is that life is going to be disrupted, that like it's scary because it might actually affect them and reach their neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And I think that's a real thing. That hopefully that opens your eyes, because if you feel that sense of fear, that is a sense that everyone who's been subjected to the system has felt their entire life. And there's no letting it just kind of wash over you.
The other night there was a lot of looting happening in Vallejo and Richmond, which is not terribly far from where I live. And I started listening to the police scanner, and I definitely got in that frame of mind of being like, I'm scared somebody's going to come break into our house. And nothing good was going to come from that place I was in that night, that fear, because it was like stuff like, oh, I should go buy a gun, or I should, like, I got into this like incredibly panicked mindset. Um, and I was reminded the next day, like, I grew up with stories not of MLK but of Gandhi. Like Gandhi, total like civil disobedience, peace. And like when you look at the actual history, there's so much violence associated with Mahatma Gandhi. And like he wasn't waving the stick, but there was a lot of violence in those moments when he was leading marches across India. And the same is true for MLK, especially as he got assassinated. And like there is violence in these moments, and there's violence because of like what has been earned through inaction over this time. It is the result of that inaction come to bear, because as somebody put it to me, society's rules broke down when the police murdered uh, uh him that night. And when that happened, then the other rules of society start to crumble in people's hands too. And it takes time to rebuild that.
And the degree of disruption and unrest is commensurate 100% with the feelings of injustice. And you know what? It in the grand scheme of this thing, if you're afraid that the protest will reach your front door, participate, right? Like coming together and demanding the change, right, and seeking justice is the smallest trade-off for coming together, right? Like
Yeah.
that's what we're asking for. We're like,
when it comes to the things that you care about, you stand in the way of danger. You don't stand aside. You show up.
I don't know what I mean, there's so much more to say. I also want to say that, like, by talking about this, it's on you guys out there to also, it's us we're putting ourselves out there because we want to be held accountable, right? Like when in discussing, in the three of us, whether we should talk about this on the podcast, and like we fully acknowledge, there are so many other people who either are directly impacted by injustice or have done the research, or researchers themselves, and are better informed about it, that you could listen to, and we want to point you to those people also. But if you listen to us every week and you have a relationship that you build with us, and hopefully you share some of, if not our exact, our worldview, but in the same kind of open-mindedness and critical thinking that we want to apply to the things we do, in covering all the other topics that we cover, we want you guys to hold us accountable in the same way that we're trying to hold, each other accountable too.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can I share the best thing I heard today?
Yes.
It came from a surprising source. It came from the U.S. Army General Mark Milley. He wrote a letter, and at the bottom of the letter is this handwritten sentence: "We all committed our lives to the idea that is America. We will stay true to that oath to the American people." I feel like what he's talking about, he's clearly talking to U.S. soldiers. It's true for me too. I remain committed to whatever this crazy idea that is America. And I feel like by being American, I have an oath to like the people here. I'm not moving to Canada. We're going to make it through this. And like, I don't know why, like a hand scribbled note by a general in the army meant something to me, but it did. Because it reminded me that there is a whole lot of good and across this country. and people committed to the right thing. And it's just going to be a messy path there.
I saw that today in droves in Mission Dolores Park.
Mm-hmm.
I believe in the fundamental goodness of people. And when we hear about, National Guard coming out for these, to quell the looting, so many of those people are just kids, right? They're 20-year-olds, they're 22-year-olds.
You mean the National Guard?
In the National Guard,
Yeah.
exactly, right? And we know those people, right? We have people in our extended family who are part of the National Guard, who are in the process of getting ready to be deployed somewhere, right? And we know we trust that the people that we know are good people and will hopefully make good decisions, because they're put in these incredibly difficult situations as well.
Well,
because
yeah. I mean, you're right, but there are orders, and the National Guard is to follow them. And I do think that like the one.
You're starting a whole nother podcast right now.
I'm sorry. No. I'm just responding just real briefly. This draws it back to a positive note. I do think that the arrest of the other 3 officers today sends that message that if you see something, say something. Even if you're a police officer and another police officer is doing something that you disagree with.
Yeah. Also, I want to go back to the way in which we are keeping ourselves informed about what's going on in the world right now. And so much of it is through social media. And I think I said at the beginning, like the platforms that have allowed, this to spread, and it allowed this to feel like not only a moment, but a different moment, right? Are also the same platforms that keep people isolated. And these platforms, even cable news, it succeeds, right? Because of the bite-sized nature of it, because of the things that tap into us as consumers of media, these primal urges of like reading things of short attention span, and 2 of like information being distilled, and of, frankly, these gotcha moments, right? So much of what I see in social media is, they were wrong. Look at this. And I fight the urge on a daily basis to fall into that trap, because I think so many people who are not being supportive of the movements right now, their distaste for it is because of these like gut responses.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And whatever media they're consuming, whether it's social media or otherwise.
And we're probably being influenced in some way in that regard too. Like that the movement is more pure than in actuality it is. Yeah, I don't know. Like I find myself wanting to take a social media break this week, and certainly a cable news break, which is completely distasteful to my emotional state.
So regular show next week, or
I don't know. Like I feel like the world has changed 6 times this week, so I want to see where the world is about 30 minutes before we record and then decide. But certainly we're not going to go reverse order. That would be
I think we'll definitely be covering and catching up, but like the world is a different place, and I think it's okay for us to acknowledge and to revisit and to share, right? Like, one of the great things that I'm very fortunate to have is you guys, the 2 of you that I get to chat with, especially these past 3 months on a weekly basis, for oftentimes longer than we plan to, 2 hours at a time, because it's therapeutic. I'm looking at a camera lens right now, but hearing your voices, it's a conversation that I look forward to, and I know a lot of people look forward to listening to, and I think it's a part of who we are as people now, like to talk about these things.
Norm's Therapy on YouTube now.
Hey, I don't have to pay for it.
Maybe there's something to this no music thing. We'll have to see.
Thank you out there also for listening. just listening, right? Like in all senses of the word, not just for tuning in, but for keeping an open mind and open ear, especially if you're someone who, subscribes to us and listens and watches. We know not for this type of content, right? We are not a political show or YouTube channel or podcast, but we're people. And over the many years that we've been doing this, you come to know us as people as well. And we recognize that you're people out there too, right? You are not just makers, but you're people with families and lives. And we all as a nation and a world are being affected by this. And especially if you're someone who doesn't completely agree, thank you for listening all the way to the end. And, and if you have criticism of the way we talk about things, or if there are blind spots that you think that we should be looking to, we'll look into it. We just hope that all of you out there are keeping open minds as well, and having these conversations.
Yeah, feel free to reach out to us in the comments, whatever platform, or on the Discord. We're pretty findable people.
Yeah. Like and subscribe, folks.
No, I would welcome that. I would honestly, I would love to hear anyone who just would like to calmly have a discussion, another point of view, something we're not considering. We don't consider all angles, and I would love to hear that.
I'm going to pull back the curtain. This is our second time recording this episode because we felt dissatisfied with the way that we were able to process our own thoughts the first time we did it. And it's not because we want to put out, we're not, I think Jeremy, you're saying, don't we strive to be as good as we can be? And I said, right now we're kind of B- people right now. And that's okay, right? Like, we're not perfect people.
No. But I do strive for a solid B. Just as
What do you think our grade is? Let us know in the comments. Like super last thing. The weirdest thing at the protest today is somebody was holding up a sign for their YouTube channel where they talk about, I don't know what they're talking about.
You're kidding.
But he literally yelled like and subscribe across a wave of people. It was the most absurd thing I've seen in a long time. And I've seen multiple people on unicycles at protests. So this is pretty absurd.
Yeah. All right. Love you guys. And we'll see you next week. Stay safe. Good night and good luck.